Right, good evening. Welcome to this week's Parsha Shiur. Parshas Behar. We have normally it's a double Parsha, often it's a double Parsha, but this year it's a single Parsha. And they're just two ideas that I'd like to share with you. Two very, very interesting ideas. Now, the first idea, I think I've mentioned before some years ago, and I just want to repeat it because I want to add something. I try not to repeat, but there's something I came across which I want to add, which I think is a very interesting addition, which is relevant. So, last week was Parshas Emor, this week is Parshas Behar. Interestingly, in last week's Sedra, we deal with countings, and in this week's Sedra, we deal with countings, but they're different countings. Because in last week's Parsha, we're talking about Sfiras HaOmer. What we're going through the period of time we're in right now is Sfiras HaOmer is actually contained in last week's Parsha, but this week's Parsha talks about counting, but we're talking about counting the Shemitah years, 7 cycles of, and eventually coming to the Yovel, the 50th year. And there is a very interesting, although similar psukim, there is a very interesting difference between the two, which I want to just explore. So take a look at the first box. Again, if you're listening online, email please at j.golker@gmail.com and I'll send you the handout. Says the pasuk in last week's Sedra, Usafartem lochem mimochros hashabbos miyom haviachem esem al tnufa sheva shabbosos tzmius tiena. Well-known pasuk. Next line. This is a pasuk in this week's parsha, Parshas Behar. V'safartem locho sheva shabbosos shonim sheva pa'amim. 7 cycles of the Shemitah cycle, which gives you 49 years, and then you get to the Yovel on the 50th year. Very similarly sounding psukim, but there's an interesting difference. Last week, in Parshas Emor, talking about Sfiras HaOmer, Usafartem lochem, Loshen Rabim. This week, Usafarto locho, in the singular. Why the difference? So, the Gemara in Menachos, in the next box, Daf Samach Hamad Beis, says, "V'safartem lochem," which is again Parshas Emor last week, Sfiras HaOmer, "Sheitei sfira lekol echod ve'echod." This is an obligation on every single individual to count Sfiras HaOmer. By the way, the whole, are you in, are you not in, are you still counting? That discussion is often misunderstood at it, because even if you're not in, you missed the whole day, oh my gosh, I forgot to count yesterday, I'm out. That means you can't make a bracha. There's no problem, and one should really continue counting without a bracha. So that is not always so understood. But either way, Sefartem lochem, shetei sfir lekol echod ve'echod, says Rashi, shekol echod chayev lispor. Every individual is obligated to count. Now, when it comes to Yovel, based on the pasuk in this week's Sedra, the Rambam in Hilchos Shemitah v'Yovel Perek Yud Halacha Aleph says, "Mitzvahs asay lispar sheva shonim." There is a mitzvah to count the 7 cycles of Shemitah year, of the Shemitah cycles. V'lekadesh nasa chamishim, and to sanctify the 50th year. Shneimar v'safartu lacho sheva shabbosos, etc. The pasuk in this week's parsha. V'shtei mitzvahs elu mesurin, the mitzvahs of counting Shemitah and Yovel, are handed over lebeistin hagadol bilvat. This is an obligation not on every individual, but on the beistin, on the Sanhedrin. So, that explains the difference. In last week's Sedra, Sfartem lochem, there is an obligation on every individual to count Sfiras HaOmer, but in this week's Parsha, counting the Yovel and the Shemitah cycles is an obligation on Sanhedrin, which is therefore the Loshen Yochid v'Safartem locho. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, Zichron Racha, when he talks about this, he puts it in a way that's sort of an insightful observation that he makes, is that counting the Omer is the duty of the individual, counting the Yovel is the responsibility of the Sanhedrin, and the important principle that emerges is that individuals count days and leaders count years. What does he mean by that? He means that, and this by the way, is in his book Lessons in Leadership. He has an idea of leadership on every parsha of the Torah, and this is from, I think, either Parshas Emor or Behar, I forget. The principle that emerges is that individuals count days and leaders count years, is that a real leader sees way beyond the next 24 hours and the immediate impact of something. The anecdote that he brings, which he says it refers back to the Chinese leader Zhou Enlai. He says that in the 1970s, when he was asked what he thought about the French Revolution of 1789, the Chinese leader Zhou Enlai replied, "Too soon to say." Now, the truth is, it's an anecdote which is well known, but it was probably said about the student revolution in France, in Paris, in 1968, which was a decade earlier. But either way, too soon to say reflects the vision of a leader, because what is the longer term impact? Well, time will tell. And the truth is, there are lots of examples of long-term leadership of that perspective throughout Jewish history. From Yirmiyah is a good example. Yirmiyah lived in the time of Churban Bayis Rishon, and he was preparing Klal Yisrael to go into Golus. He foretold the destruction of the first Beis HaMikdash, and he prepared Klal Yisrael. Now take a look at box C. Look what he tells them. Ve'ela divrei ha'seif asher sholach Yirmiyahu hanavi miYerushalayim el kol ha'om asher hegla Nebuchadnezzar miYerushalayim bavela. This is what he sent Klal Yisrael. B'nu votim v'shevu. You're going to be in Golus not for 5 minutes. You're going to be there for a long time. It turned out 70 years. Build houses and dwell there. K'chu noshim v'hilidu bonim v'bonos. Marry, have families there. V'dirshu es shalom ha'ir asher higlesi eschem shama. Seek out the welfare, the benefits of the city, of the country where you will be in exile. V'hispalalu ba'ado el Hashem, and daven for them to Hashem. Ki b'shlomo yeh lochem shalom, because their peace will be your peace. Their success is going to be your success. This is the makar of davening, making the tefillah l'shalom hamalchus. And I know, I've seen machzorim, I'm sure you've all got as well, the old machzorim, a tefillah for the Tsar, a tefillah for, the royalty of the day. So that is all based on this pasuk in Yirmiyah. And that is a long-term vision. To understand, for long-term success, to understand you're not there for 5 minutes, and this is how you should conduct yourself in Golus. Another example is Rabbi ben Zakkai. Rabbi ben Zakkai famously escaped from the besieged Jerusalem in Churban Bayis Sheni, and when he finally managed to have his meeting with Vespasian, he asked for 3 things. One of them was Ten Yavne v'chachameha. So the Gemara says they were critical of him at the time. Why didn't you ask for X, Y, or Z? Just don't destroy the Beis HaMikdash. He could have asked for that. The Gemara answers that he felt that he couldn't get it. Hatzolah Purta, a small respite. But the understanding of Ten Yavne v'chachameha, please save for me the seat of the Sanhedrin and the Talmidei Chachomim, because that was the long-term, the assurance of the long-term survival of the Jewish people by having Talmidei Chachomim, leaders, and a Sanhedrin. So that's really the long-term vision of Rabbi ben Zakkai. The whole concept of the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos and Pirkei Aleph Mishnah Aleph, also Siag LaTorah. That is a long-term protection of Klal Yisrael, of their whole ability to withstand the Golus. And really, if you think about it in our generations, the post-Holocaust era, how the leaders of the post-Holocaust era were able to rebuild, amid the ashes of the destruction. We had a fellow in school last Sunday week ago. His name was David Halperin. So he's got a whole Lashon Hara campaign. He spoke, they use these bracelets and these keychains and whatever. Lashon Hara lo medaber elai. So he's got a whole thing, a whole program about it. Fine. So we got him into school. He spoke, but when I was speaking to him at breakfast time, he said, I asked him, "Are you related to the famous Rabbi Yaakov Halperin?" So he said, "Yeah, my Zayda, my father's father." Now, who's Rabbi Yaakov Halperin? The famous story with the Ponovitch Rav, who had survived the war. He was out of Europe. He was out of the danger zone. He survived. Sadly, his wife and 11 children did not. And he rebuilt the Ponovitch Yeshiva. He came to Eretz Yisrael, came to Bnei Brak. He was walking around, and this Rabbi Yaakov Halperin was a wealthy fellow, owned a lot of real estate in Bnei Brak. And the Ponovitch Rav said, "I want to build." And Rabbi Yaakov Halperin said, "I'll give you this land. This is the mount, this sort of the high point of Bnei Brak. You'll build a yeshiva there." And the Ponovitch Rav, got very excited. And this is where the Beis HaMedrash is going to be. This is the Chad Ochel. This is the dormitories, the shirums. The Beis HaMedrash is going to fit 500 kids. They started with 6 kids. They thought he had lost it. 500 kids? You crazy? And he understood that's what they felt. And they said to him in sort of a polite way, "Rosh Yeshiva, we think you're dreaming." And he said to them famously, "I may be dreaming, but my eyes are open." And that's long-term vision. That's for Sefarat L'chol. That's really what it's about. Now, and like the Mishnah says, the Gemara says in Talmud, Eizeh Chacham haroyes hanoila, to see beyond. And I said to the boys when I introduced this fellow, I said that I told them about who Zayda was, what is Zechus, to give the land for the Ponevezh Yeshiva and everything that came from there. But the challenge sometimes is with teenagers generally, and sometimes all of us, is we don't see beyond the next day. When I'm talking to kids often, they don't think about tomorrow, they don't want to have for supper tonight. And often I see a kid who's not engaging fully, I'll bring him into school with his parents, I'll sit them down, and in front of the parents I'll say to the kid, tell me, describe yourself, how old are you? 16 years old. Describe yourself age 26. What do you mean? Yeah, 26. Tell me about yourself. He doesn't know what I'm talking about. Are you married? Do you have children? What are you doing? Are you studying? Are you working? Are you in your kollel? Just tell me about yourself. And that suddenly opens up a little bit of a world of, this is where my father Zichron Ruch always used to tell us, what you're going to be when you're older, you're now becoming. You don't just wake up to be that person, you've got to work towards something. That really is the difference between Sefarat Lachem and Sefarat Lecha. Now, why do I mention all this? Because at the moment I'm reading a fabulous art scroll biography of someone called Rav Nota Greenblatt. I don't know if you've read it or you got it, but it's fabulous. Very, very interesting. A very interesting person. A Gan Olam, a tremendous Talmid Chacham, and probably one of the main Talmidim of Moshe Feinstein, very close to him. But he was not a Rosh Yeshiva in New York. No, he could have been, easily, I think he was, offered very big positions, but he decided to go off to Memphis. Memphis is not a famous bastion of Torah Jewry, but he went off there. He achieved tremendous things. And the book is just fascinating. But just there's a couple of things which I think are relevant to what I've just spoken about, and that is, he was an expert in Gittin, and he would fly all over the world, and he procured Gittin in the most remarkable situations. He once wrote to his Rabbi, because he had to produce Gittin in a place called Tucson, Arizona. Now, when you write a get, you need to reference the place where you are, and you reference it in relevant to rivers which are sort of approximate to that place. Now, there are 2 rivers adjacent to Tucson, but the trouble is they're dried up. So in the winter, they're full, but in the summer, they're dried up. And the question is it good enough to refer to a river which no longer has any water in it because it's dried up? Is that sufficient for a get? That's a difficult question. Is it still recognized as a river? So he writes to Moshe Feinstein, his Rebbe. You see the original letter. Anyway, so this is in Chaf Vov Adar Sheni Tovshin Mem Aleph, so 1981. And this is Ramoshe's response, Malas Kos Yedidi, Harav Agon Marina of Nota Tzvi Greenblatt, etc., etc. Hini Mashamati, to the Horace Shabeir, Taksin Sherov Hashona Ein Shamayim, Elaraka Sheyodim Gishomim, etc., etc. Now the answer is he gave, to summarize a long, complicated tshuva, Ramoshe said that it's fine. You can reference these rivers even though currently they've dried up. And he gives 2 reasons for it. Reason number 1 is that although there's no water in the river right now, but there is a clear indentation of where the riverbed is and where water will come at some future point. And secondly, although no longer a natural reservoir, should there be some sort of intense rainfall, then the riverbeds will once again be filled with water. The author of the book, I forget who it is, he makes the following point. He says this was more than just a tshuva to Rav Nota. This was his life's perspective, because he understood that his job is to make sure there's an indentation, and there will be, and water will come at some point. I've got to just make sure that there's a keli for that, and then in the fullness of time, water will fall, and it will be recognized as a river once again. And he therefore did, I'll give you an example. I took a photo of this particular page. Let me see if I can quickly find it. Here it is. Rav Nota once confided in his son, the hardest mitzvah he had to perform was a bris milah bizmanoi. He was a moel as well, sheikhet of moel. So why was bris milah bizmanoi so difficult for him? So he said, Daddy, what's so hard about it? His son asked. He said, let me explain it to you, said Rav Nota. I get a call from out of town. The family isn't religious, and the bris is on Shabbos. I have to leave my wife and 5 children and head out of town. But the family's home isn't kosher, and so I have to rent a hotel room, and put my food there. I cannot carry my milah equipment, and so I leave them in the family's home. Then I have to walk from the hotel to the house. On one occasion, I was told that I must wait for the family's rabbi to arrive. He finally did. He showed up right before sunset in golf pants. He had come straight from the golf course. That's what's hard. So he's Moshe Nefesh, week after week, flying all over America, doing milas. He's a Gan Olam. He could have been the greatest Rosh Yeshiva anywhere. And yet he would fly week after week to these outland places, not religious places, because he was sowing seeds. And he explains how he did it based on this psak, as it were, this concept, this principle, that so long as there's an indentation, there'll be a time where the rain will fall again and it will be again recognized as a river. And the stories bear fruit to that. Remarkable stories one after the other. So that is really an example of the long-term view that Shemitah and Yovel represent. Okay, let's move on. Let's go through the opening psukim of Parshas Behar, because I think there's also something very, very interesting, and this I saw in the sefer called the Drash David, the famous Rabbi David Hofstetter of Dir Shu fame. Let's go through the psukim, and then we're going to ask several questions on the opening psukim in Parshas Behar. Okay. Vayidaber Hashem al Moshe Bahar Sinai Leimer Daber Bnei Yisrael v'Maratzu Aleim. HaKadosh Baruch Hu speaks to Moshe Rabbeinu Bahar Sinai. Ki sovoy el haaretz asher ani nosin lachem v'shavtem haaretz Shabbos Lashem. There'll be Shabbos Lashem. There'll be the Shemitah. Sheish shonim tizra sodecha v'sheish shonim tizmer karmecha v'savtecha tvoso. For 6 years you work the land, and then you harvest all your crop. V'hashana hashvius Shabbos Shabbos niyeh la'aretz. The 7th year will be a Shabbos for the land. Shabbos Lashem, Sotcha Le'Sizra, V'charmecha Le'Sizmar, you don't work the land. Pasuk Hey, V'sofarz Lecha Sheva Shabbosos, Shonim, Sheva Pa'amim. 7 lots of 7 Shemitah cycles. V'hoy Lecha Yimei Sheva Shabbosos, Hashonim Teisha V'arboim Shonim, which give you a total of 49 years. V'havar to Shofar Trua B'chodesh Hashvi, and then, on the 7th month, i.e. Tishri, Be'eser L'chodesh, which is, of course, Yom Kippur, by Yom Kippurim, Taviru Shofar b'chol aretzechem. You blow shofar throughout the land. This is Yom Kippur of the Yovel year. V'kidashtem es shnas ha'chamishim shana. You sanctify that 50th year. Ukrosem drar ba'aretz. It's called a drar, a free year. L'chol yoshver Yovel hiti elochem. It's called the Yovel year. V'shavtem ish el achuzasai. Each person, the land that we got when we went in with Yeshua, goes back to each person. Ve'ishal mishpachto tashuvu. Every slave goes back to their original family. Yovel hishnas hachamishim shana tzia lochem lo sizru v'lo siksru. And it has all the halachas of Shemitah. That Yovel year has the halachas of Shemitah that you can't work the land. Now, 4 questions that Rabbi David Hofstetter asks. The primary sort of function of the Yovel year, apart from being a Shemitah year, is that the slaves go free. If the mitzvah applies only to Jewish slaves and not to every single member of Klal Yisrael, then why does the pasuk say Drar ba'aretz lechol yoshveha? Why is it lechol yoshveha? It's not lechol yoshveha. Drar means freedom for all your inhabitants. It's a freedom for the slaves. Why lechol yoshveha? Question number 1. Question number 2, that the setting the slaves free, the halacha is, only applies when most of Klal Yisrael live in Eretz Yisrael, which a lot of these halachas apply. Why is that? Why is it that Yovel only functions when Rov Klal Yisrael are in Eretz Yisrael? Now, also interestingly, Chazal say that slaves only go free after the shofar is blown on Yom Kippur. Now, why? What is the connection I put here between the mitzvah of setting the Eved free and Yom Kippur? Why Yom Kippur? The beginning of the year is Rosh Hashanah. Why did you dafka blow the shofar, which symbolizes and actually activates, triggers the slaves going free? Why Yom Kippur? What's the connection with freeing the Eved Ivri and Yom Kippur? And lastly, is this Gemara in Rosh Hashanah? If you take a look at the next box, Rosh Hashanah daf ches base, the pasuk says, "V'kidashtem es shnas hachamishim melamed shemiskadeshes v'hileches mitchiloso." That the actual Yovel year begins at the beginning, but the slaves don't go free fully until Yom Kippur. So what does that mean? Mikano Rabbi Shmuel b'nei Rabbi Yochanan Berika, mireish hashon of Yom Kippurim, lo hoya avodim niftarin b'oteihem. They don't yet go home on Rosh Hashanah, the beginning of the Yovel year, v'lo mishtabdin ladnem, but nor do they work for their masters. Ella, what do they do for these 10 days? Oichlin v'shoisin, they eat, they drink, v'smeichin v'atrusehen b'roshehen. They're wearing crowns on their heads. Kivin Shegi Yom Kippurim, when Yom Kippur comes, Tiku based in Bashofa, the based in blow shova, Niftra Avodim Lebateim, and then after Yom Kippur, the Avodim go home, Vesodas Chozrus the Baalehen, and then all the land goes back to the original owners. So the puzzling thing about this is that the slave, the Eved, stops serving at Rosh Hashanah, but he actually remains in the master's house, as the Gemara says, Oichlin v'sheisin v'itrasein b'rosheihen, with their crowns on their heads. Why doesn't he go free on Rosh Hashanah? What is this whole sort of quasi-status that for the first 10 days he's not working, he's eating there, enjoying himself in his Odin's house, and then he goes after Yom Kippur? What is that all about? So, the David Hofstetter gives the following very beautiful answer, which answers all 4 questions. For the Odain, the owner of the slave, being an Odain is ingrained in your soul. And his use to people, I remember when I was in yeshiva, a friend of mine was in Kol Torah, and some boys came from South Africa to Kol Torah, and they were used to having, maids in the house. I don't know what the story is nowadays, but in those days it was very common. Everyone had maids, and everything was done for them. The first night in Kol Torah, my friend told me that the South Africans, they took their shoes off and they left them outside the dormitory, just by the entrance to the dorm, to their room they were staying. Why? Because the maid will come and just polish the shoes the next morning. I think they forgot to tell the Hanhola of Kol Torah about that, so they just found their shoes unpolished the next morning. But that's what they're used to. If you're used to something, the superiority is very much ingrained in your soul, and to the same degree, subservience is ingrained in the soul of the Eved. The point of Oichlin v'sheisin v'smechim v'trasein b'roshein is that they have got to demonstrate being an Odain, eating and acting out, not as a free man, in your Odain's house, in your Lord's house, in order that you get rid of that feeling of subservience. And the Odain has got to see it. All of a sudden, sitting at my dining room table, the slave who was working me for the past who knows how many years is now sitting at the head of the table, eating and drinking, wearing a crown, as if that means he's lording himself in my house. This is an exercise to get rid of the feeling of subservience on the part of the slave, and also of superiority on the part of the Odain. It's that is the exercise. Interestingly, the Rambam says, in Hilchos Mitzvah, what we said above, in Hilchos Yud, mitzvah saseh liskor b'shofar b'asir l'tishri b'shnas hayovel. There is a mitzvah to blow shofar on the 10th day of the 7th month. Mitzvah zu mesur lebeis din tchila. This is first handed to Beis Din, and then kol yochid v'yochid chayav liskor shnei taviru shofar. Says the Rambam, based on the above Gemara, that not only do Beis Din blow shofar on Yom Kippur, but every person, kol yochid v'yochid chayav liskoya, every single person is obligated to blow. Why? The answer is that it's a call for the whole nation to blow the shofar to announce that the slaves are free. And the individuals, they blow to remind that they are Hashem's slaves as well. They're all avodim. We're all equal in this area. We're all avodim to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Now, what day is the most appropriate day to demonstrate and to declare that you are an Eved Hashem? Yom Kippur. That's what it's all about. And therefore, we dafka wait until Yom Kippur. The connection between setting the Eved Ivri free and Yom Kippur is that ultimately we're all avodim to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And the Odain needs to remind himself of that, and therefore every single individual has to blow shofar to remind ourselves, every one of us, that ultimately we're all avodim to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Now, why is it that it's dafka when most of Klal Yisrael are living in Eretz Yisrael? Because the answer is, says Rav David Hofstetter very beautifully, that in Golus, the harsh persecution brings us closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We're living in Golus, sadly. So we walk down Gold's Green Road with Brent Street. Last Shabbos, walking across from Gold's Green Road over to Brent Street over the ridge, a car goes past and shouts, but that's becoming, sadly, more and more common. When we're comfortably independent in Eretz Yisrael, and we think everything is okay, then we're faced with a challenge of feeling self-sufficient, and then HaKadosh Baruch Hu commanded us to free the slaves, blow the shofar, and remind us that we're actually HaKadosh Baruch Hu is our master. But when we're in Golus, we don't always need that reminder. And just now, I was walking back from Mincha, and just outside, there was some billboards. So Nebuch, all the photos of the hostages were put up, all torn down. Right? All torn down, and some they were only put up yesterday. So these are just reminders that we're in Golus. I mean, sadly, the last few months we've had constant daily reminders that we're in Golus. But the point is, in Golus, almost we need less of a reminder that life is not as it should be. But when the majority of Klal Yisrael are living in Eretz Yisrael, then we have the challenge of feeling self-sufficient. And then HaKadosh Baruch Hu commanded us to free the slaves, blow the shofar, remember that we are avodim to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So it's a very, very interesting concept of, let's call it yearning for Yovel. That the mitzvah applies not only to Jewish slaves, but exactly as the Pasuk says, Dror ba'aretz lechol yeshveha, that every single one of us needs a reminder we're all avodim. And it only applies when most of Klal Yisrael live in Eretz Yisrael, because only when we're feeling that comfortable self-sufficiency do we need that constant reminder. But why is it Yom Kippur and Eved Ivri? Because that's the day when we all have to declare the Avodim HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And the day that's most suited for it is, of course, Yom Kippur. And that's why, for those first 10 days, there's this sort of hiatus. For 10 days, you've got to for the Odin and for the Eved, you need that period of time where to dispel the feelings of superiority of the Odin and subservience of the Eved during this 10-day process. So there we have it. Two, I hope, fascinating ideas. I think of Parshas Behar, the concept of leaders thinking long. That individuals count days, but leaders count years. The long perspective of the leader, and that's really the sort of the ruling and the life message, if you like, of Rav Moshe Feinstein to Rav Notzer Greenblatt when it comes to dried up rivers. That so long as there is an indentation, there's something, then there'll come a time when the water will come back and it will again be recognized as a river. And then the idea of yearning for Yovel, that is taka a reminder for Kol Yoshveha, not just for the Avodim, that ultimately we're all Avodim to HaKadosh Baruch Hu.